So just to carry on, so I'm coming back to this idea, sort of how do you know that what it is you're taking notes on is actually correct? How do you know your cultural translation is correct? So in addition to interviews, we very often do what are called life histories. And that's basically not a structured interview. You just let someone talk. And in that way, the idea is maybe then the themes that you thought were interesting are maybe not the most interesting. So in other words, you let your informant speak very freely. So if a person wishes to speak about their life and to start when they had a child, or when they began studying in Kiev, or whatever point they think is of interest, that's fine. The idea is it's not a structured interview. You allow the person to speak. And that way, the idea is then you allow themes and ideas and issues to come up that maybe you yourself didn't think about. So in other words, the idea is you're participating in things and you're observing. You do interviews that are structured, somewhat structured. I mean, you have specific topics and questions. And then you do life histories where the conversation is completely open. The person chooses to tell you about their life, how they see their life, how they see who they have become, where they are in their life, what they're happy about, what they regret. You let them just speak as however they want. And so this is meant to be another way in which, in case maybe the questions you asked during an interview weren't the best, or they weren't the most accurate, or they didn't get at what was the most important, by then allowing someone to speak freely, this is another perspective. And in allowing someone to speak freely, this is when you would want to have what I'm calling here these non-directive questions, where you just literally invite a person to speak. And then it becomes the role of the interviewer encouraging a person to elaborate, to explain more fully. And here's where, once again, it's very helpful to be a foreigner, because there's lots of things I don't understand, and I can genuinely say, what do you mean by that? Or why did that happen? Or, there's lots of things I'm genuinely surprised. And so that helps then a person speak about it. But very often, just by allowing a person to talk, you get another perspective. And once you can establish a chronology, that is to say, begin to show how one event in their life led to another, regardless of how, people usually speak about their life in very circuitous ways. But then you can then create a chronology, and you can begin to see what is causing some of the changes in their life. The chronology helps you analyze the material that you gather. But the point is, once again, you're meant to listen. No judging, just listen and be very open and just hear a person speak very freely about their life. And that's meant to be a cross-check, if you will. You have your participant observation where you're participating and you're observing, so that's one perspective. You have interviews, which are semi-structured, that gives you another source of information. And then these life histories that are very open. And the idea is you want to make sure that these are moments when you can correct your understanding and make certain that you really are understanding the society, concepts, the way of life. Right? So life histories is another means by which you can use. And when you're writing up your field notes, you're always going to want to have biographical data on everyone you speak about. By biographical data, you want to be able to say how old the person is, whether it's a man, whether it's a woman, what language they spoke, where they're from, whether they're educated, what their profession is. These kinds of basic biographical attributes, these kinds of basic biographical facts about their life. And this then helps you to contextualize, helps you to situate that person, and it'll help you explain why they do the things they do in their life and why they say the things that they say. It becomes very, very important to write everything down. And this is because what you write down becomes a record. And it's what you've written down that then becomes the means by which you don't confuse what you think you heard with what you heard. You always have to reckon with what a person said or what they did, not what you think you remember they did. So it's very, very important to write every day. I also, even when I record interviews, I always write down notes after the interview, what I remember as being the most important thing or things that were said, what I remember about the person, about the place where we were interviewed, right? We all know you might have a certain kind of conversation in your kitchen, in a cafe, in the corridor here at Kiev Mohila. I mean, place matters. You say different things in different places. So it's important to be very clear on where the interview occurred. I think this is one difference for anthropologists. When they give a quotation as to what a person said, where a journalist might have said, someone on the street reported this. An anthropologist has to tell you more about that person. Who said that, and why might that person have said that? So you're going to want to contextualize at each time. If a person thinks that, why might they think that? The job is always to explain, not to judge, but to explain. And writing down notes helps in the end. So let's talk a moment about the ethics of qualitative research. The ethics of research became very, very important in the West, and especially in America, several decades ago, when it was revealed that people who were doing research on disease literally made some African Americans sick. They made them sick. They injected viruses to make them sick to see how they could cure people. The problem was those African Americans did not know they were being made sick. And many of them suffered, and some even died. That is to say, those African Americans tended to be poor. And the researchers tended to be not poor, they tended to be white. And so you have an imbalance of power. You have people who are educated and who have authority, and in the name of science, they made people sick. No one could believe that that was true, but this was a very, very draconian, it was a very strong example. But it was understood that is very, 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 very wrong, and that cannot never happen again. That people who think that they're helping with science, whether it's medical science or anthropological science, have to know the circumstances of the research. No one can be lied to, or misled or participate under false circumstances. So this happened in the 1950s. But when it came out almost 30 years later, that completely changed the way all research is done in America. So for example, that means that everyone who does research has to explain how they are going to, I wrote here safeguard, that means protect, how they're going to protect their informant, how they're going to protect their interests and any kind of sensitivities. And the basic, what anthropologists have suggested is that the basic rule that a person should follow, you should insist that your research does no harm to anyone. If what you are going to write is going to hurt someone, then don't write it. If what you are going to ask about or do is going to hurt someone, don't do it. You must assure whoever is funding or whoever is supporting your research that you will protect your informant's interests. Now, how do you do that? How do you do that? So the first thing is, we mentioned last time about tape recording. You always, always, always have to be very, very, very clear to someone if this is an interview or if this is a conversation, right? I could have a conversation with a friend, but that person if I might use that material, then that person needs to know this conversation has now become an interview. I'm interested in what you say, and I'm going to write notes about it. Because sometimes people tell you things that are personal. And you need to think about if they are not clear that you can write this, if they don't say you can write that in your book, then you can't write it. You can't write it. And in the course of interviews, that happens quite a lot. I mean, in other words, I don't write down everything. Because when people reveal certain things, if you wrote about that could hurt them. And so you don't do it. So several things here. So the first is, if you are going to record or even write notes, the person needs to know that you're recording or writing notes. Never, ever, 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 under any circumstances, record people without them knowing. Never. For example, I mean, that is just deadly. That will ruin your reputation in like that. Certainly in the United States, if it ever came out that you recorded people and they didn't know it. I have to say, this happened to me about 3 years ago. I sponsored a Ukrainian scholar who wanted to do research on religion in the United States. And she had a tape recorder and she put it in her purse. And so she turned it on and she began recording what people were saying. It was just that was a real conversation. That wasn't, people were just talking. But she recorded it. And of course then somebody noticed that, I should say she went to it was a religious group of immigrants, largely from the former Soviet Union. And so somebody noticed that there was a tape recorder going in her purse. And they said, "Oh, please don't record that. You should turn that off." So she turned it off, but then later on she turned it back on. And she recorded other things, and they did not notice that she was recording. And so they continued to welcome her, this immigrant, it was a religious group, an immigrant community. They continued to welcome her, and they even at one point took her to another immigrant community. And of course, all this time, she has the recorder going in her purse all the time. So she has hours and hours and hours of taped conversation. But unfortunately, at one moment when this community, they began discussing money. They tend to, they tend to do things quite openly. We have this amount of money, this is where it came from, we need to, this repairs on the building, and they're all talking about money. And at this moment, someone noticed that she's got the tape recorder going again. Well, not only was that a huge, that was it. I mean, not only was she out, they'd never wanted to see her again, but unfortunately, they never wanted to see me again either, because I had recommended her. It's real, and that's immigrants who are only somewhat influenced by things in America. I mean, your average American would take you to court, you just cannot do that. So first ethical rule, whoever you're interviewing, they must agree to participate. They must agree. And in America, what they demand that, for example, in one sense, this is one of those things that doesn't work very well here. They demand that I send by the post, right, to every person I'm going to interview, a letter explaining this research. And then I ask every person to sign that they agree. They understand this research, they understand what's being asked of them, and they sign that they sign showing that they have understood this research and that they consciously are agreeing to participate. And you're supposed to have everyone sign this. I mean, I obviously explained this is not going to work if I come to Kiev and start mailing letters, and expect people to mail them back. That doesn't work. But they said, we still want to know that everyone you speak with you need in some way to explain the research. So I've been able to argue that, for example, in a place like Ukraine where you can't necessarily mail things, I will, in a spoken way, explain to people, and I will explicitly get their agreement that they are willing to participate. And it's only at that moment that you can turn on a tape recorder. And of course, if at any point if the person says, I don't want this on tape, you have to turn it off. And subsequently, as I said, people have said things, and you have to decide whether you're going to include it or not. I mean, sometimes people tell you intensely personal things, like they've been raped. Like they've been raped by their brother. Like they were repeatedly raped in the army. I mean, people tell you very, very, very personal things, or they're cheating the US government, or they're all kinds of very, very serious things that could make problems for them, whether it's with the authorities or with their family or with their friends. And this is where you have to come back to the do no harm, because they might have agreed to speak with you, and you might be recording, but then you have to think, is that going to hurt them? Is that going to hurt their relationships? To what extent do I include this? Those become very, very sensitive issues. But the key point is that you really have to think about them. Nobody should be harmed by this research. That's the key point. So, how do you not harm people? So one is, as I said, making certain that they know about the point of this research. I mean, I tell people, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book. And I'm writing all kinds of things down. I mean, I write pages and pages of notes, and only some of it gets in the book. But you have to say, they need to know what the purpose of the research is. They need to agree to participate. And then I always assure people anonymity. So in other words, you need to disguise the person so that they're not identifiable. This becomes difficult too, because often you can't take someone who's 30 and make them 75. That's a totally different generation. You're distorting your data. You can't make a man a woman, or you have to disguise them in a way that retains who they are. but give them anonymity so that nobody can read this book and say, oh, I know who this is. I know who this is. So that's a very delicate moment there. But that's one way in which you do no harm also, is that you assure the person of anonymity. I mean, I've had some Ukrainians who said, oh, I don't want anonymity. Write my name down. You can say I said this. You can say I said this. So, okay, then I write their name down. But I still often have, you can say that in the moment, but when you see something in print, maybe they won't feel that way again. It also becomes tricky when, at what point does someone no longer maybe get anonymity because they're a public person? For example, if you read the article, I quote Sofia Andrukovich in there, and I give her name. Because she's a novelist and she's well known, but she agreed, yes, you can use my name, and I sent her those quotes saying, do you agree? Because of course she spoke in Ukrainian, and so I'm translating, literally, now this is a linguistic translation of her words. I sent her these quotes. Do you agree that I print these words, that I attribute these words to you? Because I'm going to say, Sofia Andrukovich said this and this and this. Do you agree? And then of course she said yes, and that's why I printed them. But in the course of other kinds of interviews where make somebody Ivan Ivanovich and I'm disguising who they are, then I don't go back to Ivan Ivanovich and say, do you agree with this? Did you agree that you said that? I mean, if I've taped it and if he's agreed to the interview, then I quote that person. But a public person, you have to, when does a person become public? I mentioned I was interested in religion, and so somebody like Sunday Adelaja, I don't know if any of you have heard of him, I've been following him for quite some time. So at first he was just this sort of preacher in the metro that was clogging all the corridors. Nobody knew him. But he became a public persona, of course. It was tricky with him because the fact that he's Nigerian, I mean, this is really important. This is not just your average pastor. You can't make a Nigerian, I don't know what, American. I mean, it's a big deal that he's a Nigerian. So in that case, I said to him, I would like to give your name and say you said this, and say you did this, and say you're Nigerian, and say you're a Pentecostal preacher and all of that.